Greetings and welcome to all of you who are joining us today from all over the world for this latest edition of Farhang Foundation's Farhang Connect virtual talk series. I am Ali Reza Ardakani, Executive Director of Farhang Foundation here in Los Angeles. We are a member-supported, non-political, non-religious, not-for-profit organization with the sole mission to celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture for the benefit of the community at large. We are extremely excited to welcome today's special guest, scholar and author, Dr. Mohammad Gharipour, for Persian Gardens and Pavilions, Reflections in History, Poetry, and the Arts, a subject matter about Iranian culture and history that deserves much attention. Dr. Gharipour is professor and chair of the Department of Built Environment Studies at Morgan State University in Baltimore, and the forthcoming director of the architecture program at the University of Maryland. He obtained his PhD in architecture at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He has received many prestigious awards, including those from the Society of Architectural Historians, the National Endowment in Humanities, the Fulbright Hays, the Foundation for Landscape Studies, the Council of Educators of Landscape Architecture, the American Institute of Architects, and the Fulbright. In addition to organizing and chairing more than 30 panels and conferences and publishing more than 140 papers, encyclopedia entries, and reviews, he has authored and edited 14 books, including Persian Gardens and Pavilions, Reflections in History, Poetry, and the Arts, Gardens of Renaissance Europe and the Islamic Empires, and his latest book, Health and Architecture. Dr. Gharipour is the director and founding editor of the award-winning International Journal of Islamic Architecture, the co-founder of the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative, and the second vice president of the Society of Architectural Historians. Dr. Gharipour will be joined by Farhang Foundation trustee, Dr. Shazad Ghanbari. Dr. Ghanbari is the design principal at West Group Designs, an award-winning design firm whose work has been recognized and published nationally and internationally. He has served on the board of the American Institute of Architects, Orange County, and devoted his time as Director of Education. He was part of the steering committee for the AIA Chapman University, which inspired his involvement in the steering committee for the AIA San Diego School of Architecture. Dr. Ghanbari is a graduate of the 6th-cycle PhD architecture program from the Sapienza University of Rome. And his work was selected as a virtuoso for the prestigious Venice Biennale International Architectural Exposition. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming today's esteemed guest, Dr. Mohammad Gharipour, accompanied by Dr. Shazad Ghanbari. Good morning, gentlemen, and good afternoon. Welcome to Farhang Connect. We're delighted to have you here, Dr. Gharipour and Dr. Ghanbari.
Thank you, Ali Reza Jan. Thank you for your introduction. And you're always very specifically, our guest will be today's very prestigious guest, and we are very happy to have him. Thank you, Dr. Gharipour, for your adding your time and your expertise for our Connect today. And welcome, and I'm sure your book will be a great book for all scholars and who like to extend his knowledge in that regard. And we are very excited, and please start your lecture.
Hello, thank you so much, Ali Reza, and thanks so much, Dr. Ghanbari. It's my honor and pleasure to be here, and thanks again for your kind invitation. So I'm going to share my screen. Hello, in today's lecture, I will be talking about Persian gardens and pavilions. Their origins and historical evolution over ages, and how they evolved and how they were designed in different parts of the world. So I will be actually talking about this specific region that you see here, Mesopotamia and Persia, but later I will talk about the distribution of these gardens and the impact that they made on garden design and landscape design in other parts of the world. I'm going to start from one of the earliest civilizations of the world, which is Egypt, because most of us are probably curious about the garden design about Egypt and how that looked like in ancient times. So the significance of this region is that this specific region, where the overlap happened between two significant kind of major civilizations, the Semitic and Indo-European civilizations. And this is where these groups of people kind of immigrated. So as you may know, some of the oldest civilizations and the oldest cities of the world are located on these areas where these two civilizations kind of overlap. Cities like Çatalhöyük, like Ekbatana, like Jericho, and some other cities. But talking about Egypt, we don't have many traces of garden design in ancient Egypt. This actually garden scene is which is found in one of the tombs. It is actually one of the only ones that we have from that era. And this is quite interesting because, as you can see here, it is very detail oriented and it provides detailed information about how pleasure gardens, what we call as pleasure gardens, were designed in ancient civilizations in Egypt, and how they became kind of popular over there over time. So, however, talking about the Mesopotamian world, one of the earliest texts that we have from this region is the story of Genesis, which is around, roughly speaking, from 1450 to 1400 BC. And the story of Genesis actually makes specific references to the story of the Garden of Eden and the story of 4 rivers. So as you can see here, the story of Genesis is very specific when it comes to a garden, a pleasure garden, the Garden of Eden, and the fact that that garden included 4 different rivers. And then from roughly the same time in this region, we have the water god or water goddess appearing in different forms. Look at the ivory relief on top, which is an Assyrian one in, I believe it's in the British Museum now. And this is one of the oldest ones from this region that depicts a real garden. As you can see, the god of water is standing right in the center of a garden, and there are 4 rivers. And hopefully you can see the connections between the story of 4 rivers in the story of Genesis and how the water god was depicted in this ivory relief around 1200 BC. And it is not probably a surprise to you that this is actually the reason that this Chaharbagh form, 4-fold garden, became gradually popular in this part of the world, in the Persianate world, and was used as the main model for garden design over ages. But talking about, again, Mesopotamia, there are many references to gardens and trees. For example, this is an Assyrian wall relief showing gardens in the city of Nineveh, but there are also many references to gardens in the Code of Hammurabi, which are quite interesting because there are extremely specific references to gardens as sources of income and to some extent as sources of pleasure, but they are all about the laws and regulations that they had in the Mesopotamian world. Talking about Mesopotamia, well, most of you are probably familiar with Hanging Gardens of Babylon from 600 BC. We don't have any traces of these gardens, but we know about them because there were many Greek historians who wrote about these gardens and describe them in detail. So we are talking about, remember, we are talking about 600 BC to 560 BC. And again, these gardens don't exist anymore, unfortunately. And as the historical accounts show that the Babylonian king actually created and designed these gardens to cheer up his wife, the Queen Amethyst, who was from Ekbatana, nowadays Hamadan in Iran. And then roughly from that time, we have the formation of the Achaemenid Empire by Cyrus the Great. And we know how kind of rapidly and kind of how gradually actually Achaemenids, his successors, invaded different regions. And they actually ruled in in big parts of the world around actually 400 BC and even 500 BC. But we should remember, we are still talking about 500 BC. And Cyrus the Great, actually, he had the reputation when it comes to garden design, mainly because of his royal garden in the city of Pasargadae in southern Iran that was designed as a pleasure garden. This is an extremely important garden in the history of landscape design, and there is no question about this, mainly because this garden is one of the earliest gardens that was designed in that region, at least the ones that we have traces of and we know about. And it was a pleasure garden. It was designed as a royal garden. And fortunately, thanks to the excavations done by Professor David Stronach in 1970s, we know about this garden and how it was designed. And look at this water fountain and a pool on the left side. It has a very kind of delicate irrigation system. It was very well designed garden, even though it was not huge, but it was very well designed. And now on the right side, you can see a stone water course from Pasargadae. Just compare it to something very contemporary in Morocco. So you can see the similarities. It kind of gives you an idea about the continuity of these gardens in these parts of the world that I will be talking about in my lecture. But from that age, from the Achaemenid age, we have a very important text. And that's actually from Xenophon. Xenophon, in his book, actually refers to a conversation between an army general, a Spartan army general, whose name was Lysander, and Cyrus the Younger, who was an Achaemenid prince. And that conversation was about his garden in the city of Sardis, in nowadays Turkey. So in this specific conversation, Cyrus the Younger actually talks about his own garden and describes it and shows it to Lysander. And Lysander is just so amazed of the way that this garden was designed. And he keeps asking questions, and Cyrus the Younger actually describes his garden. And because of this, actually, I mean, this is actually considered a very important text, mainly because it shows how dominant it was in royal culture in the Achaemenid Empire to design and maintain gardens in royal families. And you can see this as in just one part of this text when, for example, Cyrus the Younger, he says, "Know then, it is I who measured and arranged it all." So he even talks about his role as in gardening and in measuring everything, arranging everything. He's in love with his garden. He also talks about symmetry in his garden. He's very, very specific when it comes to garden design. And it's not an accident. It shows that the royals and the royal family, and especially the king and the prince, were always involved in the design and the maintenance of these royal pleasure gardens in their empires. So there is also another reason that this text is important, because it's actually one of the earliest times that there's a reference to the word Parada Etsa, because Xenophon made references to Parada Etsa, which mainly referred to both pleasure gardens and hunting parks in the Achaemenid age. And why is it important? It's important mainly because the word Parada Etsa later was imported in Greek language and Latin and Hebrew, and nowadays we use it as the word paradise. So you can see even how the origins of the word paradise these days has to do with a real Achaemenid garden. And again, talk about these gardens, I want to just jump into a 16th century garden, almost 2,000 years later, the Finn Garden in the city of Kashan. And as you can see here, the elements of the garden are almost the same. There is a pavilion in the center of the garden. There is almost this Chaharbagh pattern appearing there. Very well designed fountains and irrigation system and water channels. And all over the place, you have trees and plants and flowers. And this is quite interesting because these gardens were created in order to create that a kind of a microclimate for the ordinary people or their owners to stay away from this hot and dry climate out there. So you cannot imagine the contrast between these spaces inside these gardens versus outside these walls that you see on the left side. And I'm sure that those of you who have visited a Persian garden can confirm this. And again, the garden, remember, it's not just about design, it's not about form, it's also about sensual aspects of the garden. It's about how we experience it. And the sound of the water, the sound of the birds, the colors, the tree, the colors and the lighting that you experience and you see in the garden. And in one paper in a couple of papers that I published a few years ago, I showed how landscape designers and architects deliberately designed gardens to function in different seasons. So they were not just designing a garden for spring or summer, they were designing gardens for different seasons. And the way that they came up with plants or flowers and the whole design was not accidental. Every single detail was carefully laid out and planned. And as you can see here in Finn Garden, the water goes through the building, which actually makes it quite unique and special in Persian architecture. And as Rumi says, beauty is the garden, scent of roses, murmuring water flowing gently. Can words describe the indescribable? And the same elements are visible in most gardens in Persia, in nowadays Iran, and across this region that I will be talking about later. But you can see these central kind of water channels, these kind of tall trees that you have, the flowers, the fountains all over the place, the pathways for the visitors to visit the garden and have kind of unique experiences in different parts of the garden. But I want to zoom out a little bit more. So that the earlier image was from Shazad Garden, and this is also Shazad Garden, which shows it actually in this in this context, in this kind of rural context. So it shows that the garden is totally located in the middle of nowhere. Look at even this one. And now you are going to ask yourself, how could they actually come up with an irrigation system that enabled them to design and construct these gardens in the middle of nowhere? So the solution actually was qanaat. So without actually going to the details of details about the origins of qanaat And the history of qanats, I can just tell you that qanat was an underground water channel system that enabled these people to bring water from faraway areas without being kind of too worried about the dearth and the lack of water in their villages. Remember that the qanats played a very important role in the design of cities and villages in Persia, not only just gardens. And that's why nowadays, when you look at Google Earth, you can find many traces of qanats, and these are the qanats in Persepolis area, as you can see here. If you just check Google Earth, you are going to find so many qanats all over the place. And there are some of them here. So it just kind of explains how crucial qanats were in creating civilization in this part of the world. But talking about Persian gardens, they became so important, such an important part of Persian culture and Islamic culture that they were reflected in different types of arts, such as carpet design or tile design. You almost see them everywhere. And they actually, Persians specifically designed garden carpets to bring to bring gardens into their houses. And we know that that tradition actually was very, very dominant even before the advent of Islam. So many of us have heard about Sasanian garden carpets and things that were, and their textile and how they use gardens in their textile design. And this is Al-Hamra Palace, the courtyard of the lions. You see the Chaharbagh pattern being used in the design of the garden in Granada in Spain. And now I want to just switch back and talk about the Persianate world. One of the most important historical figures was actually in this region was Timur, Amir Timur, originally from Central Asia, from Samarkand, from Shahr-e-Sabz originally, who chose Samarkand as his capital, and he actually played a very important role in developing the idea of gardens in this region. But there is also something important about there. Not only they had so many Persian gardens in the Timurid Empire, and we know from the historical documents that Timur was so much in love with gardens that he rarely stayed in his palaces. So he always preferred to have his tent up in his gardens outside the city walls. But one thing that is interesting is that Timur's grandson was Babur, and Babur was actually from Ferghana Valley. Babur had no power, so this is where when actually Timurids had no power, Babur formed an army and he started kind of invading these regions, and he invaded Kabul as part of his expedition. So Babur is such an important figure when it comes to the world history and more specifically to garden history, because he is the founder of Mughal dynasty in the subcontinent India. And we know from his book, from his memoir, which is called the Babarnama, that he was so in love with garden design, with landscape design, that he was even involved in the design of the garden. So on the left from Babarnama, you can see how he is communicating with the designer there, and he's talking about how to design this specific Chaharbagh there. And as you can see in the text, he's also very specific about the placement of the hose, the fountain, as well as the pomegranate trees. So in other words, he cared about the palettes, the color palettes inside his gardens. And Babarnama is such a fabulous historical document that I urge all of you to read if you are interested in historical literature. And these are the kind of scenes that you see in these gardens. And as you can see, nothing is random because everything is very well designed, even the colors that you have here. Babur's son was Humayun. And Humayun, actually, when he passed away, again, without talking about the history of Mughals, because he didn't have power, with the support of Shah Tahmasp, because he could regain his power in India. And his wife, who was originally from Khorasan, Iran, actually was the main patron, the main person behind the design of his mausoleum in Delhi, in India, which is a perfect example of a Chahar Bagh design here, and as you can see here. But there is another reason that Humayun's tomb is important, and this reason is that it is actually one of the first examples of mausoleum garden in the Indian world, but we know that that design became so popular that they continued this tradition. And these are some images from Humayun's garden. And as you can see here, the garden is not just about what you see in the outside in the garden, it's also about what you see from inside. So not only you design spaces in a very careful way within your garden, but also you care about how they are being seen from inside the pavilion. And obviously, talking about mausoleum gardens in India, the most famous one is Taj Mahal in Agra, that was designed later in 1632. So that was completed in 1632. And these are some images of that. And again, hopefully you can see the similarities, how the garden carpets, how the artwork kind of resembled what you see in the reality of these gardens. And what is quite interesting is that Mughals in India, they came up with a garden design that had some Indian elements while using these models that they took from the Persianate world. And this is another example, Shalimar Gardens in Lahore, Pakistan. And as Hafiz says, the garden is breathing out the air of paradise today. Toward me, a friend with a sweet nature and this wine. And a perfect example, I think a perfect reflection of description of what Hafiz is trying to tell us is this tile panel from Isfahan in the 17th century. If you end up visiting the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, you will see this this tile panel over there. And again, they show us how major cultural events occurred within these gardens. But another important thing is that the Persians actually designed gardens inside their houses. So they brought garden into their houses. So it was not just about a royal palace or something that belonged to the wealthy people. And this is the garden, the Aram garden in Shiraz in southern Iran. And as Sadi says, when the morning breeze blows over the rose garden, the young trees proudly wave their branches. And what is quite important about these gardens is that they were used day and night. So there were different things happening inside these gardens, and we know about them because there are many miniature paintings that tell us about things that had happened inside these gardens, not to talk about chronicles and many historical accounts from these times. And these are some other images. So for example, as you can see here on the right side, it's Humayun's birthday, and Babur is sitting there in his tent, and there is music going on, there's a dance, and on the left side, you see a palatial garden where the guest is being welcome. So at the same time, we know that many historical figures, many kings and rulers in this part of the world, in Persia, in Central Asia, they were nomads. Actually, they lived in the middle of nowhere, especially in Central Asia. And this is quite interesting to know that in many cases, they prefer to erect to have their tents up within their gardens. So in other words, they used to live in gardens, even though they were always mobile, moving from one city to another city or from one region to the other region. And there were many things happening, for example, in the house of Timur. So this is another miniature painting, which is unfortunately damaged, but it shows us an enthronement ceremony. But there are so many other things that are happening in many of these gardens. For example, from the right side, you see the duel of physicians. Again, many of these stories that I'm referring to, they are based on Persian literature, in Persian poetry, but they also happened in real time. And these are some images of the camp and how everything in the garden was always changing, because they kept moving tents. They kept moving tents from one place of the garden to the other place, to another place or to another garden. And as Sadi says, the roses of the garden are perishable and the season passes away. Again, that has to do with this concept of constant change inside these gardens. And now, actually, I want to just switch gears. We all know that water was the most important element in the construction and the design of any garden. And especially in the Persianate world, actually, gardens, the rivers played a significant role. So this is actually Zayanderud River in the city of Isfahan, my hometown. And it was actually one of the main reasons that Shah Abbas decided to move his capital from the city of Qazvin to the city of Isfahan. And one thing that was quite interesting was that after he moved his capital there, he decided to create a city of gardens. So I should mention that that idea was not necessarily new. We know from historical accounts that Qazvin, the city of Qazvin, was filled with gardens. So there are so many gardens. So many gardens existed in the city of Qazvin. There are also many historical accounts about gardens in the city of Herat. And we should note that Shah Abbas himself was raised in the city of Herat, which was an important Timurid capital. But as you can see here, on this side of this map, this historical kind of map that you can see here, they designed actually the Chaharbagh Street, which connected a pavilion, this kind of royal pavilion at the end, to the river right here in south. So this is north and this is south. And on these two sides of this garden, you have different gardens. And within them, you have different pavilions, like, for example, Hash Behesh Pavilion. And many of these buildings were described by many travelers, European travelers, who visited them in the 17th century and 18th century. But what you see here is just a small portion of a much larger master plan, which is this one. And as you can see here, this is the Hezar Jarib Gardens in southern part of the Zayanderud River. It shows how they looked at urban planning and master plan, urban planning and urban design in the Safavid age, and how gardens were being seen as crucial parts of their master plans. And this is actually what I should emphasize, is that this is definitely a revolution, not only in Persia, in Iran, but also in garden design and in urban design, in the history of urban design. So hopefully in this lecture, I could explain the connections between this Assyrian relief, the origins of gardens from Mesopotamian world into what you see in nowadays India, in southern Spain, and in the city of Isfahan, and in different parts of the world. And obviously, I had limited time to talk about these things, but these topics. But if you are interested, you may refer to these two volumes that I have: Persian Gardens and Pavilions, and the second volume is Gardens of Renaissance Europe and the Islamic Empires. In this specific volume, I talk about the fact that gardens in the Islamic world and Renaissance Europe influence each other in the early modern era, which means mainly the 17th and 18th century. And I'm going to end my lecture with this beautiful poem by Rumi, "Beauty surrounds us, but usually we need to be walking in a garden to know it." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gharipour, for this fascinating presentation. As I mentioned earlier, I personally feel that this subject of Persian gardens is an aspect of Iranian culture and history that deserves much study and attention, and we applaud you on all your work in this area. I would also like to let our viewers know that if you are interested in Dr. Gharipour's book, you may order it via the link on our website at farhang.org/Persian Gardens. I will now invite Dr. Ghanbari to join us again so we can start the post-discussion. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gharipour. Excellent lecture and very helpful to understand, especially to understanding the root of the Iranian Persian garden and how they influence from the planning, from various the art worldwide. If I may, I would like to start with the etymology of the word of the Pardes. And in ancient Avestai and Iranian language, in Avesta, talking about the royal hunting enclosure, shikargah saltanati baste. Originally, the Greek translation of the Bible, they use the word of the Pardes, paradisus, as a substitute for garden. The Eastern mythology and the religions present Pardes paradise, often described as a higher place, the holiest place, promised dwelling place of the God. Would you like to expand on that?
No, I think this is a great point because as we mentioned, as you actually mentioned, the word Pardes or paradise actually comes from the way that these gardens were, designed in the Achaemenid times. So this is what we know, but there is some kind of some complexity here because normally in our culture these days, when we talk about the Garden of Eden and the paradise, they mean the same thing, right? But at that time, they were totally different concepts. And they were, but I think without talking about these, the complexities of this topic, I think what's very clear is that this word actually originated from real gardens in the Achaemenid age. And I think this is the beauty of it, right? The fact that, we have very clear historical accounts that show where this word comes from and how later, it becomes so common to use in English, actually in Latin and other languages in Europe.
And as architect, I like to see physical transformation of this mythologic place to reality. Perhaps we should start with Achaemenids, as you mentioned, Pasargad,
Mm.
probably the oldest existing complex that we find, shadowy city palace garden. Pasargad is an extraordinary site that survived. Pasargad with enclosure walls, definitely defined by huge rectangle cut, as you show, in front of the palace with the quadruparty water division. This extraordinary four-way division, Chaharbagh, become an emblematic characteristics elements of the Persian garden. Would you please expand on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think, I mean, you already talked about the materiality of the garden, which is very important, right? But I want to mention something that is also as important as how these gardens were designed. And that's the culture behind this, right? I mean, why was it so important for them to design gardens in the Achaemenid age? I think, I mean, the key thing is this concept of happiness in the Achaemenid culture that was so important for the Achaemenid kings. And we know that, for example, the king Darius actually keeps talking about happiness as one of the main principles within his empires. And it's very interesting to see that these gardens were seen as symbols of happiness and as places where they could bring happiness to the subjects, to people. And that's why, even though we don't have traces of I mean, any major traces of the Achaemenid cities, we can guess that most probably there were gardens or some kind of parks that could be accessible to the ordinary, to the public in these ages, because of the way that, I mean, they talk about paradisus in the literature, in literature.
Confirming your theory and the things you describe, I would like to paraphrase Mehrdad Bahar in the book From the Mythology to History, defining the Persepolis as a sacred garden with the stones trees. باغ مقدس سنگی با ستونهای سنگی. In this poetic description of the Persepolis, they show how the garden design deeply influenced various parts of the Iranian art form, as you show from the poetry to painting, to carpet design, and of course, the architecture.
And Dr. Ghambari, I'm really happy that you talked about Persepolis, because I did not talk about Persepolis because of the time limit that I had. But we should all remember that they designed Persepolis to celebrate Nowruz, the first day of spring. So it's all about celebration of nature and elements of nature. And there are kind of many depictions of that on the walls in Persepolis. And I think, again, even though there were not necessarily kind of major gardens designed in Persepolis, the whole concept was about their celebration and the significance of nature.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now maybe is a good time to compare the ancient Iranian garden to the Western garden. In my opinion, Persian gardens were mostly place of the production, fatigue, and pleasure. Comparison with Western culture, from the Roman villas to Palladio villas in 15th century, garden is a part of the beautification rather than production. Please let us know what you thought is in that regard.
I think you raise a valid point. I would be a little bit kind of cautious about generalizing here, because talking about Western gardens in the West, it really depends on what time period we are talking about, or what specific region. But I think you have a very, very valid point here. And we have so many historical accounts that show that even royal gardens, there was always an economic reason behind their existence. That, for example, there are many studies on Mughal gardens in India that show that, one of the historians, I think about 10, 15 years ago, he did some studies on the accounts of these gardens and showed how many boxes of fruit they ended up selling to make profit, because that was important, because these gardens were quite expensive to maintain. So they needed to kind of generate some revenue in order to kind of keep them up to date and keep them in a very good shape. And talk about, again, comparing them to Roman villas. Yes, I think you can see, specifically if you compare the Achaemenid garden to the Roman villa, these are actually, the Roman villas are designed later. So, they have different elements. They include different elements. You are also correct that some of these Roman villas were totally kind of isolated. While even in the case of Pasargadae, I'm not saying that it was a public place, but look at the amount of isolation that it had. It just had two simple pavilions on these two sides, because when I talked to the archaeologists there 20 years ago when I started working on my book, and they said that these are where the soldiers kind of guarded this garden. So it was not a highly guarded, protected kind of entity. Even you see almost the same thing in Persepolis. So Persepolis did not have huge walls. It was not totally separated from the city. So you see that, the royal culture looked at these palaces in a different way, as if they were parts of these bigger kind of urban or rural contexts.
Right. Yes, definitely. We should travel in the Safavid period. Influence of the voyagers and travelers, like you mentioned. Perhaps we should bring the 40 columns palace, Chehel Sutun, as emblematic sample of the garden in this elegant change of the rule of the Persian garden with the new typology. Please describe and expand more that transformation of this new Iranian typology garden.
Absolutely. So yes, you are actually tackling a very good question. It's still a big question for us as historians. And as much as I like to make a general statement to make our lives easier, I should confess that there is not a simple kind of answer here, because there are so many, there are different papers kind of talking about the Chehel Sutun Palace being under the influence of the Achaemenid architecture or pre-Islamic architecture. Without that, we don't know, how familiar Safavids were with this kind of ancient pre-Islamic heritage over there. So there are questions about this. There are also studies trying to kind of make connections between European palaces and the way that Ali Gharipour or Chehel Sutun Palace were designed in the city of Isfahan. But you are an expert, you are an architect, you know that. I think, even editing a book on this notion of confluence, I think the most difficult topic to discuss when it comes to the history of architecture and garden design is what influenced what and what exactly came from that culture. So sometimes it's very difficult to trace the origins of something like, for example, what you see in Chehel Sutun design. But you are correct that it's definitely a revolution, the way that they looked at the garden, the way that they even named the garden. And we should also note that, I did not talk about this, but naming gardens was a huge thing in Persia and in Central Asia. I mean, and the names that you see, they have very important meanings. So for example, you see Bagh Firuzi, the Victory Garden, right? Why? Because that specific garden in that specific region played a very important role in military expeditions at that point. So, and this is, I think this is the beauty of these gardens, that not all of them are just places for pleasure and relaxation and meditation. They went beyond this notion of pleasure. One more thing that I want to add here to address your question is that it's also important to look at this, the master plan and the urban design of Isfahan as something that happened throughout ages, because even though Shah Abbas was the one who moved the capital, but for example, Chehel Sutun that you mentioned was designed and constructed by I mean, the main patron behind that building was Shah Abbas II.
Yes.
Right. So this urban design grew over time, and there was this kind of historical evolution, even when it comes to the city of Isfahan.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. You bring that the planning and the influence of the planning, the Isfahan worldwide. My last question will be discuss about the transformation of Iranian garden, open space, green space, perhaps healthier space, in the modern city planning, its evolution from the city garden, the famous city garden, to 21st century as a urban design and planning.
Another brilliant question. I did actually I published a book on this topic, which is called Urban Landscapes of the Middle East. I intentionally did not include the cover in this presentation, mainly because I was mostly focused on historical gardens. But as part of my argument in that book is what you see happening in cities of the Middle East in the 1960s and 70s is actually the continuation of this this concept of urban park and urban garden design that started much earlier in the 18th century. But that was forgotten in this region until it became so popular again in as you mentioned, British gardens, and later in American park system. And then you see this whole movement of designing parks in the Middle East in 1960s and 70s. I'm sure that you have been to major parks in Iran, in Tehran, for example, Lale, Farah, these are, I think, beautiful examples of this transformation of garden design into spaces that became open to the public and played such an important role in cultural affairs. I mean, many of us, no matter where you grew up, for example, I have great memories of my childhood in these parks, either in Isfahan or in Tehran, and mainly because they were designed intentionally, especially after 60s and 70s, in order to play a vibrant role in culture and society. And I think they were absolutely successful, and one of the most successful things that you see in urban planning in modern urban planning in Iran specifically is actually this notion of park design that became so popular in different parts of Iran.
Thank you so much. It was very great and listening to you, and very wonderful things for education. And I hope that all the colleagues and the friends they listening now, they enjoy that.
Thank you so much again to you and to Mr. Ardekani for the kind invitation. It was my pleasure and my honor. And in case the audience have any questions, they may feel free to contact me. My email address is mgharipour@gmail.com. Maybe we can just share it in the chat box or in the chat box here. But thanks again. It was a pleasure.
I think they have some question, Ali Reza Jan.
We do. We have a lot of questions from the audience, and we just have very limited time. Obviously, this subject has so much potential for more discussion, but I'll get right to them. One of the questions was the cypress tree seems to be omnipresent in most depictions of Persian gardens. Can you explain the significance of this particular tree and why it's chosen in so many garden depictions?
Yes, actually, they symbolized permanence, and that's why they became, I mean, they were extremely important symbolic elements, not only in paintings, but in real gardens. They also, I think, the beauty of them was that they created these kind of green walls around the gardens that they totally separated them from this harsh climate outside. So they kind of protected gardens. So they were protectors of gardens. I think that's why they were, they were extremely important in garden design in the Persian world.
And they're so beautiful.
Absolutely.
Another question we have is, you mentioned that many kings used the design of their gardens in their palaces, and you kind of briefly touched upon this, but was designing gardens also popular amongst the common people in the past?
Yes, it's a great question. As I mentioned before, we see two types of gardens. Gardens that belong to the royalty, to kings or wealthy people, right? But you also see gardens within ordinary houses. Even nowadays, you see, I mean, you go to any house in any of these small cities and small towns in Iran, you still see elements of nature inside that house, whether it's a water fountain and plants and trees and flowers. But again, Persians, Iranians, actually, they brought garden into their houses. I mean, if they were wealthy, they could afford a much bigger garden outside city. But if they could not, at least they could have small garden within their tiny houses in the middle of these dense cities.
I think we can end the discussion with this final question. You mentioned that Persian gardens influence other aspects of Iran, in art in Iran, like poetry and miniatures. To what era do you see Persian gardens influence in Iranian art?
What era you said?
Yes.
You see them all over the place, from actually, as I mentioned, from Mesopotamian age, you see trees, you see elements of nature, and you see gardens, to even nowadays contemporary paintings. Again, we should remember that when we talk about gardens, I'm trying to have a more kind of holistic view. Even when you see traces of trees or reflections of plants and flowers, they still have something to do with this notion of garden and garden design in the Persian world. So you see them in miniature paintings, in reliefs, in almost everywhere.
Great. There's many more questions, but unfortunately we don't have time. I want to thank you again, Dr. Gharipour, for joining us today. And I want to once again remind our viewers that today's talk was recorded and will be made available on farhang.org later this coming week. And also to remind you to look into purchasing Dr. Gharipour's book, which has a link on farhang.org. So we thank you again. We thank you everyone who joined us from all over the world today for this exceptional talk. And we look forward to welcoming everyone again for our next edition of Farhang Connect. Thank you, Dr. Gharipour. Thank you, Dr. Ghanbari. We bid you farewell and wish you a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you, Ali Reza Jan.
Thank you so much, Ali Reza, and thanks so much, Dr. Ghambari. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you.
you.
Have a
Thank you
nice
both.
day.